telecom geek, and I do love these issues deeply, and so it's quite an honor and pleasure to chat with you this morning. So to get us started off, AT&T, at Bloomberg News, we sometimes struggle with the size and scope in our first paragraph. That's a big deal. The company, the descriptor. When I began covering AT&T, it was a phone company. AT&T is now the largest pay TV provider in the U.S. It's the #2 wireless carrier. So just to kind of set the scene briefly, how would you describe AT&T and where AT&T is going?
Well, it's an integrated communications company. I think that you can define that in tomorrow's terms, and that's very broad. People communicate in new platforms. Kids today, they think of the phone as a camera more than they think of it as a phone. They communicate through short videos and pictures. And so we're really just evolving with the state of communications, and we believe that the right strategy is to be integrated in order to deliver the best service that we can.
And of course, the theme of today's event is investment in broadband, and of course AT&T is and has been a leader in that category. Given the drastic changes happening in the telecommunications, media, communications space, and because AT&T is as you noted, a very broad communications company, what are the guiding principles for your investment strategy?
Well, I think that the one thing about broadband is that it's you're in a race against the applications, and so you want to get as much speed and bandwidth in as many places as you can, because if you put it out there, people will consume it. And so against that backdrop, what we try to do every year is we reevaluate, what are the economics of this? How much can we do? How much can we afford? How much is affordable? How much has a good return of investment dollars? And every year, certain aspects of that case, if you will, get better. Labor may get more productive. We may have a breakthrough in how trenching is done. Electronics get less expensive. So every year, technology makes things more affordable. And so what we try to do is grow our footprint, grow our reach, grow our speed to the maximum extent that it makes sense. And that's I've been at AT&T now going on my 9th year, and every year there's new things that weren't there the year prior that allow us to widen the footprint and expand the speed.
And you wrote a great piece recently, a very interesting piece in the Harvard Business Review about the reskilling of AT&T's workforce and the massive amount of work that is required to do that. And you know that AT&T is really trying to move from the legacy businesses to the next stage, which is software-defined networking, cloud, internet-based IP, moving from the public switch telephone network to IP. And so one of the things that I found interesting in reading that piece was the AT&T worker, the typical AT&T worker today. I mean, AT&T is a $240 billion company, and it has how many employees? 280,000? 280,000. And so as you look ahead, there are a lot of people who made their careers in AT&T going on truck rolls to install copper infrastructure. And so as you look at these employees, what is your strategy to I'll start with a broad question. What is your strategy to bring them along to the next phase?
Well, I think that if you look at our company, what makes it unique, you can start with the heritage. It's 142 years old, so it's not a teenager. And a lot of when you start with the foundation, the quality of our people is extraordinary. And there are many, many instances where you meet third and fourth generation people at AT&T. My aunt is 105 and 9 months, what I've discovered is when you get over 100, they're like small children again, you have to get a credit for every month. Calling her 105 doesn't seem to do it when it's been since January. So, and she worked for the phone company, and she cares very deeply about AT&T and what it's up to, and still reads about it. And when you look at what has made our company not only an icon, but sustainable, what you want to do is you look at the change on the horizon. You want to bring the employees with you. You want to, you know, because you go to a new technology area, you bring a refreshed workforce, you don't even know if they can get up in the morning and get to work on time. You don't know how they play with one another. The one thing we have culturally is great people that work well together, and we push change effectively. And so when you look out and you see the big skill change that's required, what we're trying to do is to give everybody ample resources, ample time to prepare themselves for jobs in the future. And we're not in every case driving the change. Innovation, competition, customer demands, technology, evolution, all of those things create the backdrop where, you know, every company must invest to go to move into the future. And so we feel like that backdrop says we know where we're headed. It doesn't all happen overnight. Let's put programs in place that are allowing employees to learn and go with us.
So if I'm a mid-career AT&T employee and I learned how to install infrastructure, work on infrastructure in the old network, what skills do I need?
Well, depending on the type of job, well, first of all, let me say that one of the things we do is we provide a lot of information. So if you go into, if you're a manager at AT&T, in the management side of the house, you find yourself, we actually are very clear about the evolution of your job. Today you have a job, in the future we call it a role. A role is your job plus the skills you need as it changes and widens. And then you're able to find the curriculum that gives you the skills that you need to move from here to here. What's really spectacular, I think, about what we've done as we've evolved the program is we've also said, pick any future you like. And so if you don't like the job that you would naturally progress into, pick the one you like, and we're not restricting you. We're providing the skills, maybe a lot more hours for you to move from an outside plant engineer to a big data scientist, but it's available. The courses are there, the curriculum is there, the reimbursement's there, and so you can paint any picture you want of your future. And so I really think that there are three categories of folks that you meet that are sort of mid to late careers. The one, which is inspiring to me, is someone who will send me an email and say, look, I only have 3 years left. I don't want to go through all that skilling. Why don't you put me on a platform that sunsets at the same time I plan to retire so that, you know, someone can jump into the new job, if you will. And that's really inspiring. You see people that will sacrifice in that way. The second thing you see is the stories of inspiration. And I'll tell you the one that to me was most inspiring. I was on an elevator with a woman who had just a giant kind of ear-splitting smile. And I said, why are you so happy today? And she said, I finished my first course on the way to a nano degree. I said, what kind of nano degree are you getting? She said, big data. So I said, why are you doing that? Why did you choose that? And actually my question was, why big data? But she answered the question more broadly of why take courses. And she said, to inspire my children. I thought, wow, that's amazing. And she said, you know, every year I give myself something for my birthday. I buy a purse or jewelry. And this year I'm going to give myself a nano degree for my birthday. And I think my kids from that will learn that you've got to, in today's world, you're going to have to constantly keep your skills current. She said, I'm hoping to inspire them. I think that that's a second model that, again, for me personally, is very inspirational. And I think that the third model is those that that maybe aren't jumping in and are just sort of a little nervous, looking for peers, looking for coaching. And so one of the things we've been very attuned to is provide, you know, various support systems, mentors, coaches, even apprenticeship programs we're rolling out now where you can apprentice in a new job for a short period of time, see how you do, see how you like it. And I think that those sorts of programs, we're really trying to listen to what the people need to progress, and we're trying to build to it.
What has the response been to these programs? Are people saying, you know, this new communications future, I might have a place in it? Or are they saying, well, I'm so close to the end, you know, maybe I don't want to learn new skills, or maybe I need to find a different career?
280,000 employees, the answer is always going to be all the above. But what I would say is, if you look and you say, anytime you're going to experience a big change personally, what are the stages you go through? You can actually see that manifest as a prevailing mood. So in the beginning, the mood was fear, anxiety. My skills somehow may not last. You know, there are people that say, boy, if I can just duck this for 4 years, you know, I'll be fine, because that's how long I intended to work. But then after you start to look at the programs and you stay with the programs, I think people start to look at it, and then it goes to, hey, I'll give it a shot. And I would say right now, where we are in the program, we're in our 4th year from our original designs. I would say the vast majority of people have taken courses, find them to be very high quality, are learning a lot, and are really getting advancement and understanding. And we're so just to give you an idea by the numbers, we've had 2.3 million courses completed. We have tens of thousands of badges earned. If you think about a badge would be maybe 8 courses, so I can become maybe not a deep expert, but I really understand an area. We have thousands of nano degrees. What a nano degree is a small degree that bolts onto your undergrad. So if I studied math 30 years ago, and I spent my time doing engineering and evolving over time, I can take a nano degree, which is very, much smaller and more targeted, and take a nano degree in data science, and I augment it with my math degree. It behaves more like a master's, but it's built around the job instead of around a certification, if you will. So we have thousands of those. And then we have master's programs online that we're doing with Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Georgia Tech. And those are, allow people to get in and get formal master's degrees in things like computer science, data analytics, and so on. Kind of future skills, if you will. So we're doing everything from badges to inventing new categories like nano degrees to affiliated master's programs. And I want to point out, I don't want to make it sound like you have to be an intellectual superpower and go get a master's degree. I mean, if you don't even have an undergrad degree and you've just been experiencing in the field, there's a lot of things you can go in, and you can move from a technology like TDM to IP, Internet Protocol. And just that technology refresh, you're probably learning some basic vocabulary, learning some basic mechanical type of items. You can evolve your understanding. So it really runs the full gamut. We have hundreds and hundreds of courses available for folks.
And of course, this reskilling is necessary as AT&T makes the shift to software-defined networking world, to the cloud, to more IP-based, over-the-top video services. And of course, for many telecom and cable companies, the fear is that the broadband network will be commoditized. That broadband will just be a commodity and a big pipe going into people's homes or to their telephone. So given all these changes, given the work that AT&T is doing to retrain, reskill your workforce, this sprint to reinvent yourself, how are these changes going to counteract that, essentially?
Well, I think that when I look at the big picture, it doesn't matter what you do as a living, everything that is capable of being commoditized is on a path to commoditization. So if my specialty is language and language translation, and now I have apps that can do on-the-fly translating, then I've got to change. It doesn't matter the field that you're in. So I don't think our field is any more targeted other than for its scale. But when you have technology advancements that make them easier and easier to use, you always run that risk of commoditization by simplicity. If that's the greatest problem that we have, then I think we're in good shape, because it means we're innovating. And so as long as we get a level playing field against those who seek to commoditize, because I can tell you, I spend a lot of my creative waking hours figuring out how to commoditize things that you don't think of today as commodities. And in this new world of software-defined networking, you're going to see some really interesting jujitsu over the next couple of years. So, I think it's all fair game right now. As things move to software, as data becomes the valuable commodity here, the software industry, like look at this. If you think about a software application, what is it? I'll give you a descriptor to describe it as a commodity. An application is a dumb event generator. All it does is it generate events. And as an application, it held all my data, we as a company, it held my data hostage. It imprisoned it inside an application. And then it got smarter on its own, and I had to pay more and more and more every year for that software. Now I'm saying, liberate the stuff and get out of buying software and just have event generators. And that's called microservices. And that software business is going to change so dramatically over the next few years. You look at cloud and infrastructure, what's happening with data centers. I mean, that's what makes it exciting times right now. Everything is up for grabs in our industry. And our industry boundaries between us and what have traditionally been web-scale players is falling very rapidly. It's becoming a very blurred line.
And of course, I would be remiss if I did not bring the conversation to regulation legislation.
Oh boy.
We are in Washington, right?
Yeah. I knew you'd get there sooner.
It's in my nature. What can I say? You hear a phrase a lot, regulatory overhead.
Yeah.
And as you think about the AT&T of tomorrow, are there any regulatory impediments? Are there anything that our lawmakers, regulators, state, local, federal, are doing that hinders you in any way?
Well, since we're saying things that are in our nature, I can't help but comment on your socks. Trying to level the playing field. I think that when you look at regulation as a large-scale investor, you're always looking for the path where you can serve customers' needs, you can invest with the least friction and the best returns. And so, in some respects, you talk about broadband. Broadband is one of the tougher cases because its returns usually come near a decade. Whereas if you do things in software, some of the returns are 2 years in nature. And so you try to balance that. You have a portfolio. You have to stay true to your roots, be in your business, and invest. And so within the portfolio, every year you look and you say, where's our best investments to be made? And you reallocate. You reallocate across wireline and wireless. And a very important consideration is how level is the playing field and what's the regulatory environment like.
So is there anything this FCC is doing that's giving you agita?
Well,
And agita is an Italian word
for what? Discomfort?
Discomfort.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have to bring a Wikipedia up to get interviewed by you. No, I think there are things, there's always going to be things that we disagree with. And this current FCC is no different in that regard. But that's been true of every FCC regime. And I do think that the current environment, one of the things that's, I think, been very positive is an understanding of how central wireless is to this economy in this country. It was only a decade ago where there was a big debate in the telecom industry as to whether the axis of innovation was Europe or Asia. And now, there's no question it's in the United States. The innovation's coming from here, the adoption's coming from here, 4G we led, 5G we're leading. And so I think that the FCC has certain things at the big picture level that they understand, which I think are going to be very helpful. And it's been helpful lately to do things like dealing with millimeter wave spectrum. And some of those things are going to be very important as those foundations. And there's some other stuff that at a tactical level we vehemently disagree with. And all we really ask for is a level playing field, us against our competitors, and regulation that encourages investment. And anything that works either tilts the field against us or discourages investment are going to be things that we're going to work against.
Staying on wireless for a moment, with regard to 5G, of course there have been a lot of tests recently by carriers and their suppliers, and also a lot of conjecture from observers about what 5G is or should be. So when will or did AT&T write its first check for 5G? 5G gear.
Gear? We wrote our first check this year. I don't think we wrote it last year. Yeah, probably this year. Well, here's an interesting thing. So this probably runs counter to how a lot of people think about things. But being on the side, I was the chief technology officer, and then I ran the network and in my career. And so I was very close to each of these technology evolutions. One of the things most people don't realize, 2G to 3G to 4G, every time that we did one more G, it had a whole bunch of network to it, but the business case was based on cost. I have to deliver X number of megabytes, the spectral efficiency is so much better, I bought it. So now when you go to 5G, everything changes because the characteristics of the network have demand for it that is really unprecedented. So if you look at virtual reality, augmented reality, the autonomous cars, you look at just the explosion of video. Let me just give you a simple example of how this works. If I was a roller coaster lover, I used to text for 20 kilobits and say, I love roller coasters. And then for about 380 kilobits, I took a picture and sent it. And then accompanied a text, I'm about to ride this monster. And then we went to the video. And the video was about 4 meg for 1 minute video. So same person. When that becomes a VR capture, it's 1 gigabit. So you think about 20 kilobits to 1 gigabit in a 10-year period, that's extraordinary. You take autonomous cars, it's still uncertain exactly how the driving mechanisms are going to be, but the maps are moving from static to live. When you have a car that's trying to update the map, it's 20 kilobits per kilometer. Now we're going up a live map with a gigabit per kilometer. So it doesn't matter how fast these things go or which ones go first and in which order. That's an explosion. And so 5G has more use cases attached to it, and it's much more of a customer benefit-driven network than probably anything that's ever been built. Because its characteristic is it handles that super bandwidth that's required for video, it's super fast, it's super low latency. And so it's going to provide a backdrop for all that. So actually, we have people calling us to say, when would be ready, because I want to build the capability into what I'm going to be doing in the future. And that's just really unprecedented in the wireless industry.
So we are running short on time and wanted to lob it over to the audience to ask any questions at this point. I believe there are 2 microphones in the back, is that right?
Yeah.
Jana has it.
Test.
So if anybody in the audience has.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Paula Stern. I used to be with PPI a while ago. And my question is coming from the work I do at the National Center for Women in Information Technology, NCWIT, where AT&T has been loaning us some wonderful people to work with, Thaddeus Arroyo in particular, who was on our board. Yep. And I'd like to ask a bit more about the role you feel women and other underrepresented minorities might better play in developing new technology, creating new technology at AT&T. Have you had your own internal experience in terms of mapping the recruiting and the retaining of these women and underrepresented minorities in the outcome of new technology? What has been your experience?
I'll give you 3 or 4 points. The first is I couldn't be prouder of AT&T and its and how we view diversity in our everyday lives. You need only look at that video that our CEO put out a couple of weeks when he talked about Black Lives Matter. It was a very proud moment for everybody in the company, just for the rest of the world to see how we view diversity in our workplace, so it's central. As it relates to women, within our operations, the women of AT&T have some of the largest jobs operationally that we have in our company, and they do extraordinary work. And so what we've been trying to do is build leadership programs that are designed specifically for women, by women, and build cohorts of very strong leaders that teach, nurture each other, and have a unique perspective on the challenges that each would have. And that program has been extremely successful. And so you look at the graduates of the program, our whole Southeast region's field force is run by a woman, Tracy Garner. It's the largest vice president job in the company. She has 14,000 people. So we don't just put them in positions of authority, we put them in all positions of really large scale and make sure that as they learn the business, they teach the business. And so we not only have programs internally, we have ones externally because we're so proud of the women in our leadership ranks that we want them to give back to the community so that the community can give back to us. And the last point I'll make is that just to understand how hard this job is of recruiting women in technical fields. Over the last several years, we've averaged 50% recruiting of women, despite women in engineering dropping to only 17% of the workforce. So for you to get 50% of yours from a 17% number, you have to be extraordinarily good at over-indexing, which means that if you're going to go get all of the women or people of color in engineering programs that might be under-indexed to the general population, which is what we try to do, you really have to get great at recruiting. And I think we've done a fabulous job, and I couldn't be more proud of where we are programmatically. We always have more work to do in the dialogue and in understanding what are the current issues, but I think we're doing a great job. But thanks for your question.
Thank you for your answer. I believe we have time for one more question for John. Anybody?
This was really convenient. The mic runner just really had to reach. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very informative talk. My name is Athar Javed. I represent Indus, a local think tank. My question about broadband, expansion broadband and all the good things that are coming, are there going to be any enhanced security features as the infrastructure improves? Or is going to be the same old way, limited to the software?
I think security is one of the parallelisms that we have to deal with every day. So if you think about networking and its rapid evolution, I want to give you a framework to think about, security. The same way we talked earlier about needing education and skilling of your workforce to run in parallel, because if technology moves faster than the workforce, then you're going to stall out for lack of resources, right? And so you have to keep those in parallel. The other side of it is security has to run parallel to both your people and your technology evolution. And so there are big breakthroughs on the horizon. The network is an incredibly valuable asset that provides data on individuals. And so the evolution for us, the describer we use internally is we need to not only understand what's in our network, we need to understand who's in our network. So our goal is to lower the user's involvement in security and materially raise the security levels. And we can do that because the network can inform us the probability of you being you. And then someone can say, hey, if it's an 80%, then I probably want added security because you're doing a financial transaction. But hey, for you just to surf the internet, 30% is good enough. So the network needs to get more sophisticated to be able to identify who is on the network so that we can complement what's on the network with who's on the network and try to ensure that our security regime is as good as it can possibly be.
Well, did you have a follow-up? We are rapidly running out of time. John, final words, thoughts?
Yeah, I want to just in kind of keeping with the spirit of employees, I just want to take a small minute for a commercial. I know that Hurricane Matthew's passed, but we still have people down there busting their humps to get service restored. So I want to just give a shout out. Every chance I get in video, when we have folks that are on the second week of those 20-hour days to restore service for our customers, I want to recognize both the victims of that storm and then those that are. And then the last thing I'll say is I think that what we're discovering in this program is 4 years in, you have to start. The old phrase, if it's a big job on the too hard to do list, the best way to get started is to get started. And and I think that's it. You don't have to be elegant in the design of this. I think most companies are going to be faced with this, and I think you really have to get started and have the courage to go in, dialogue with people, adapt, make some mistakes, change. But I think 4 years in, we have a program that looks good, but it didn't always start out that way.
Well, thank you, John. And please join me in thanking John for his time. Thanks for the chat.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
So, minute break while we bring our panelists on stage and continue the event. So sit tight.
Thanks again, Paul. Appreciate it.
All right, you're good for
wish that everything he said were as true as he said it is.
Get to some of that.
No, I'm not going to say that. And as they buy things. So that's not the problem.
Not the
No,
right
it's
to work
very different.
issues.
No, not at all. They like to put their call centers in right to work states. But, and then it's our challenge to organize, make them union members. We have to bargain for them and represent them. So that's our challenge. But that's really not our problem with AT&T. But I'd love to talk with you more about the industry.
Thank you all.
We should get together.
Thank you all for joining us for the second part of today's program. Our panel discussion on broadband and investment. So all of our panelists' bios are in your packet, so I don't want to waste too much time with their bios, but of course to my left is Debbie Golman from the CWA, Tom Power from CTIA, Michelle Ionno from PPI, of course, and James Assey from NCTA. So I'm thrilled to be here to talk with this distinguished panel about broadband and investment. And we just heard, of course, from John Donovan about the work AT&T is doing to prepare its workforce for the shift in communications networking. So to start us off, I thought, Debbie, you can field the first question. And that is something I think about all the time as someone who's followed the space for some time. Are the workers, a typical telecom worker today, are they prepared for
Or online, that ideally your inquiry will be who has the skill and the training and is located in the United States to be able to respond to your questions. And those people are members of the Communication Workers of America, CWA. We have 110,000 people that we represent at AT&T. This is actually the second largest private sector union company in America. I'll leave you all to guess which the largest is. And AT&T has always understood the value that a partnership between a collective organization like a union and the management can add value to the company, whether it's in the workplace or it's at a strategic level. And as an example of that, I will just say that as AT&T, for example, recently bought DirecTV, really unique among companies in America, AT&T said, if our employees at DirecTV that do not have union representation choose to have union representation, we will, through a process of third-party certification, recognize their desire to have a union. And in fact, through that process now, the 10,000 frontline employees at DirecTV are now represented by the union. Now, why is this important? I'm going to throw out just two statistics. We've been talking today about the challenges of productivity. In fact, this industry, the telecommunications industry, is a highly productive industry. And if you look at the growth and productivity of this industry over the past 25 years, it's grown 138%. Now, in the old days, whenever the old days were, as productivity would grow, those people who create those values, the working people, would benefit. And where there was union representation at AT&T, for example, through collective bargaining, we were able to increase the compensation and the living standards of our members commensurate with the productivity that they generated. That has stopped. Whereas productivity over this period increased 138%, workers' average earnings increased 7%. That's basically flat. And this gap, which we see in our larger economy, between those who are creating the wealth of our country but not reaping the benefits, and that all the value is going to the very top, not just the 1%, the 0.01%, and the implications that that has for our country is quite disturbing. And so one of the solutions, and the union has always worked with the company at AT&T to partner in recognizing that this is a constantly changing technology, and that the people who work as technicians, the people who work as customer service reps, the technology is always changing, the jobs are always changing. And therefore, beginning in 1986, 2 years after AT&T agreed to break itself up, and there was major turmoil in the employment situation, we negotiated with AT&T a joint labor management education and training program called the Alliance for Employee Growth. That continues to this day, funded by AT&T, jointly managed on the board by both union representatives and by the company. And the ideal here is that not only are employees told, well, there's going to be software-defined network, and so you take courses on your own time. Maybe we'll pay for them, maybe we won't, and we'll give you certifications. But through this joint program, we have a mechanism by which AT&T works with our organization, our trained educators, to say, here's where the jobs are going, and here is the career path, and here is the funding to go into the workforce, develop programs. Adult learners learn differently. An online course, self-paced, is not necessarily the way that many adult learners actually learn. So developing programs jointly and having the staffing to go in and roll out those programs in a way that works. We've worked with AT&T. Now, this Alliance program doesn't cover all of the units at AT&T, but this is our ideal of how to work together to manage change.
So we are in the final weeks of a very historic election. I'll just leave it at that. And of course, considering the topics that have taken center stage during the debates, it's not surprising that an innovation agenda, innovation policy has not been talked about more. So, question for the entire panel: what would you like to see from a new administration with regard to innovation policy, and thus spurring more investment in broadband and people? Anybody want to?
I'd be happy to start with that. I mean, PPI has for a long time advocated for regulatory improvement, and I think that affecting the telecom industry in particular, that would be a huge thing to happen to spur innovation and investment. And I think that it's the reform and getting rid of the outdated and overly burdensome regulations, but really just across the board putting the emphasis on innovation. The fact that no one's really talking about it in the election just goes to show that the policymakers aren't really putting that first either. They haven't been, and unfortunately it doesn't seem to be on the forefront right now. So whether it's the lack of infrastructure investment coming from the government or the lack of concern of the impact on innovation and investment in the regulatory framework, just having that on the forefront of policymakers' minds would be really helpful across the board, and especially to these heavily regulated and also heavily investing industries such as telecom.
From my perspective, I think you always look forward by looking back, and one of the things that I think I would encourage, whoever wins in the November election, is to really take stock of the tremendous progress that has been made over the last 8 years, particularly among technology, communications, cable industries in really revolutionizing the way we communicate and really setting the foundation for many of the applications that we enjoy today. When the Obama administration started, it started off with a national broadband plan that I think there are things in there that I probably would quibble with, but I thought it provided a pretty good snapshot of kind of where we were at the time. We were a nation that, lived on 4 megabit connections, and I think there's no question that we've evolved in ways that have really inured to the benefit of consumers since then, and we've done that through a lot of moxie, a lot of innovation, and as the report kind of lays out, continual capital investment, because you're never really done with broadband. When John Donovan talks about how the network is changing, and you're seeing data growth rates between 30, 40, 50% year over year, every year for a decade. It's a tremendous operational task to make sure that your networks are always in front of consumer demand, and that your workforce is capable to be able to provide service, but also deal with the variety and the complexity of services that are today. So I do think there are clearly some areas where folks are going to want to focus on. We still have plenty of areas in this country that maybe not great in number, but still lack what is we believe is acceptable service. But we need to really take, I think, stock of where we've come from, where we are today, so that we can engage in a responsible discussion about how we can get to the goals that we want to from a technology standpoint.
I share a lot with what James said. I'll just give you the wireless perspective, which is, if you look back over the last 8 years, it's been pretty impressive from a spectrum perspective. We've had the biggest auction ever. The AWS-3 auction raised $40 billion. We're marching our way through the incentive auction now, which is a first of its kind auction. Nothing like it has happened in the world. The FCC put out their notice and order on the high bands, the 5G sort of centric bands. That's all been a really positive step, and hopefully we'll be able to keep pushing that kind of agenda as we look at the next administration. To get down into the weeds a little bit more, one of the things we do worry about is infrastructure, particularly when you talk about 5G, where you have smaller cells covering less distance, but with much greater capacity, much less latency. The big plus is the challenge being the distances are much shorter, and so you're going to have a much denser network, and that means installing these much smaller transmitters all over the place on buildings and light posts and bus stops and flagpoles or wherever we can get them, and making sure, particularly at the local level, that local policymakers understand the huge benefits that can inure to the municipalities, to the towns, to rural areas, if we can get past this obstacle. And it's funny, I was talking to some of the really smart engineers at one of our member companies who were working on 5G, and was at their lab and at their demo sites, and they're explaining all this, very sophisticated physics about 5G and spectrum that was mainly going over my head. But I said, well, what's your biggest challenge? What keeps you up at night? And they said, where are we going to put the transmitters? Like they figured out, or are going to figure out, the really hard physics stuff, but it's just the basic physical platform of where are we going to put these things. I think, in talking about the campaigns, one campaign has laid out a very comprehensive tech proposal, and sort of like James, folks can quibble with all sorts of it, but it's very comprehensive, addresses these issues, and the other one hasn't, so we don't know what we're getting there.
So of course, in a 5G world, you need more small cells, you need more macro cells, but wireless carriers are still having difficulty siting and still running into issues. The FCC's dealt with this a few times in a high-profile way. Went to the Supreme Court. There's a lot of activity around this section of the Act and the rules. So, in your view and what you're seeing, what are the regulatory hindrances at the local and state level?
Let me answer it this way. Ideally, this should be a collaborative approach, right? We shouldn't be talking about some binary fight in Congress or in the courts or at the FCC. Those things will happen, but this is a win-win, right? I grew up in a little town in Virginia called Warrenton. It's about 50 miles southwest from here. And I was just reading in the last couple of weeks in a couple different publications about things going on in Warrenton where they have focused on broadband. They have partnered with George Mason University to start an incubator program. And on Main Street of Warrenton, which looks like Mayberry from Andy Griffith, there are 8 tech startups there. And they said they have a social hour every Friday, and one of the things they talk about is their rivalry with Culpeper, which is the next little town over, but who's doing the same thing. And what's that doing? It's having folks, it used to be you got out of high school or college and, like me, you didn't move back to Warrenton. And now they're getting folks to come back. Debbie talked about the challenges with the workforce. It's a challenge within tech companies, it's a challenge across the country with displaced workers, and how do we retrain them to be able to take advantage of this. But that's the kind of message we have to serve or send to communities to make sure they understand, whether it's Warrenton or Washington or out in farmland with agriculture and everything that wireless technology is doing there to increase efficiency of how you plant, how you irrigate, how you fertilize, all this being done through sensors and GPS and other wireless technologies. It's a huge advantage. And I think it's, and then with the cities themselves, if you think about traffic control and monitoring how our maintenance of streets, and even things like, where they put these sensors on trash cans, and when the trash can is full and you don't have to send the trucks out. At the bus stop whether there are people waiting or not, or are the buses full, and you can just save. None of this sounds real sexy, but it's huge for efficiency. It makes for a much more productive town or community, saves costs, lowers taxes. It's win-win-win, and that's the message we gotta send, as opposed to thinking about this in terms of preemption and legislation and things like that. Inevitably, those kind of discussions come up, but there's so much to be gained if we can think of this more collaboratively.
And regarding federal policy, as we look ahead, rural broadband availability is still an issue. Of course, in the last 8 years, the FCC has certainly put forth a number of proposals, and we've had rules and orders, completely reorienting the Universal Service Fund to support broadband was a generational moment for sure. Do we need more stimulus particularly out in these rural areas to get broadband in towns that might not have the providers there with the economic case to be made? I mean, does the federal government need to go in here and stimulate these areas to get broadband in places that still don't have it?
Yeah.
Look, we still have 3 areas that we have to address in terms of our broadband gaps. Let's start from the progress we've made, as James said. I was looking back at the policy proposals we were writing in 2007 when CWA launched something we called our Speed Matters High-Speed Internet, Affordable High-Speed Internet for All Americans campaign. At that point, the FCC's definition of broadband was, do you remember? 200 kilobits per second. And we put up on our website a speed test. We were the first ones, and now lots of people have it. But when we collected our first data, what was the average speed that people were getting? 2.3 megs per second. So now we talk about gigabits. Now our definition of broadband is 25 down and 3 up. We've made a lot of progress, and as the PPI reports show, 20 billion a year by the biggest companies, you multiply that times 7, 8 years, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of private investment that is really in wired and wireline infrastructure. But we still have 3 gaps that we've got to address, and this means government policy. One is the rural problem, but it's not just rural. We have 34 million Americans households who do not have access to broadband. And it's mostly rural, but about a third of them are still in urban and suburban areas. And that's number one. And we do need to have programs, not overbuild, not financing duplicative networks, but we need to have programs to address that. And the Connect America Fund, the Universal Service, is designed to reach about 10 million of those households, or customer locations, but it's not everyone. The second is we still got an affordability problem. Now this Lifeline for Broadband program and some of the Internet Essentials and AT&T's low-income program are designed to make affordability for people much less of a barrier. But we have about a third of our country that doesn't subscribe to broadband at home. And of those who do connect, low-income people tend to be on their smartphones. Now, if it's a tablet, you can do homework, you can apply for a job. But if it's a smartphone, I'm sorry, you cannot do your homework or apply for a job. So we've got to address those issues. And then the third is what I'd call the price gap or the competition gap. And that is that in many places, James's companies are the only choice that people have for truly high-speed broadband. There is no choice. And if competition is going to drive innovation and drive down prices and hopefully improve quality, we need to also have policies, as John Donovan said, that give a level playing field so that we have investment giving people choice. And I just want to add to that, while we all talk about wireless and 5G, wireless does not exist without wires in the ground and on the poles. And in fact, as you would tell me, and John would say, you're the experts, not me. With 5G, you need to have fiber capacity to take all of that traffic, all of those bits and bytes that are going from your device to that cell. So we really are looking at, and let's hope that the economics now have changed in such a way with 5G that we're not leaving a lot of the country either with a choice of one or no high-speed providers, but only either 0 or 1 choice. But the economics now will change, and people will have choices both for high-speed wireless and high-speed wired infrastructure.
I agree with a lot of what Debbie said. I'm struck by the fact that, I think people have traditionally looked at wireless and cable as very different animals. But the technology is really evolving to the point where I think the wireless networks and the cable networks are really going to start to look a lot alike, and that's because of all the devices all of the folks in the audience have in their hands. The average consumer has 10 devices that they connect with Wi-Fi, either when they're at their home or whether they're out on the go. So there's a strong fiber deep into the network, maybe all the way to the home, maybe part way to the home, and then there's a hop because people don't like to be tethered all the time. And whether that's over unlicensed or licensed spectrum, to the consumer, candidly, it's kind of irrelevant. But as these uses get more intense, as there are more consumers putting more demand on the network, I mean, you hear some of these discussions about virtual reality and the additional network loads that creates. That requires networks to get denser and to essentially offload the data onto the higher speed transmission links. So that creates a lot of operational challenges, but what's interesting is I think the operational challenges become very similar between traditional wireless companies and cable companies. I do think, Debbie puts her, finger on both the access gap and the adoption gap. I mean, I think you have to start fundamentally from the societal question. We do believe that we want to provide universal service to everyone in the country, and then the question is, how do we do it? Cable today is providing its broadband service to roughly 93% of households in America. And we know the last households in America are very expensive if we wanted to string fiber to them. I think in 2008, the estimate was that it took something like $13 billion to reach the last 250,000 households. I mean, that is an awfully big number. But I think to our benefit, we're seeing technology march on. And what 5G and gigabit Wi-Fi are able to do is going to radically change the nature of firms that are able to reach these, and places that we normally once had written off as being, we're going to be lucky if we only get one provider, may in the future see competition emerge. So I think we have to be very targeted in our approach to federal policy with respect to where we put support. We don't want to disrupt all of the private investment that year over year continues to be plowed back into building these state-of-the-art networks. And we have to focus on the adoption issues, which are, we could spend an entire hour just going through the multiplicity of challenges that folks face when adopting, whether you're talking about, device, the digital skills, the relevance in people's lives. I think we are making great gains, through a lot of initiative, certainly a number of cable companies, but also a number of other companies looking at ways to kind of bridge that divide. And I think we made an important step with Lifeline Broadband, but I'll just give you one specific example of unfinished business. You had a number of companies that were trying to focus on particular types of households, households with school-aged children, to be able to provide support for broadband at home. And one of the biggest problems was always trying to figure out the eligibility and who fit into this category of people you were trying to reach. And it was always very frustrating because this was data that people had, right? The Department of Agriculture knows who's on the schools and lunch program, and we know who's on SSI and these sorts of things, and we didn't have any type of way to actually verify, who these people were. And one of the things that I think was set up in the latest Lifeline Broadband is essentially trying to develop some way of, at a national basis, on a federal basis, determining eligibility and really removing a regulatory or barrier to private action and partnerships that address the adoption problem. So, that may be one place to start.
I just want to comment on a couple things James said. One is sort of this melding of what we've thought of as the traditional wireless industry with what we've thought of as the traditional wireline industry. 5G could be a strong competitor, and we're hoping it to be a strong competitor for the last mile into the home for broadband. At the same time, you're seeing cable companies looking at the incentive auction and thinking, and in other ways, getting into the traditional licensed wireless world. And where one place where you can really see these two confronting each other is in unlicensed, where there's been some contention going on about wireless carriers attempting to deploy LTE in what has been traditionally a Wi-Fi band, and we're working through that a little slower than we would have hoped. But it is, all of it is a testament to how these two industries are beginning to look more and more each other, which presumably is keeping a lot of our members and James's members up at night, but probably should be good for the consumer. So that's all good. And I'd just say one thing on the government role. There's always going to have to be a government role, because if the market dynamics aren't there to provide broadband that everyone does need, the government's going to have to step in some way. And the big challenge is, if it involves taxpayer money, there have to be strings attached, because you want it to be spent well. But that is always going to be a hindrance for private companies. It makes that project look different than all the rest of what you're trying to do. And so the trick is, how do you make that as easy as possible for private companies to get in there? Because obviously, it would be, Secretary Clinton has proposed a $25 billion infrastructure bank, which would go beyond broadband, but that's great, but wouldn't it be better if it was just our $25 billion we were putting in? So how do you really incent that?
I think we should kick it over to the audience for any questions. If anybody has a question at this point, yes.
Hi, I'm Lois, and I had experience with broadband. It was most awful. I've been waiting for it and calling. When you going to start it in my area? I thought it'd be a break in price, but I was really wrong. They couldn't even tell, or rather I couldn't tell, how many hours we had used, and it seemed like it'd been on there for 2 days, and then they said, well, that's your time, you're off. I said, what is this? I really couldn't understand, so naturally I removed it, and I'm waiting to see if there are improvements, or maybe I just didn't do it right. I don't know, but what is that?
I thought I saw a hand back there. So, Lynn, of course.
Hi, Lynn Stanton from Telecommunications Reports. I was wondering if anyone could quantify, at least in terms of percentage, the challenges in the backhaul area, the wireline, versus the challenges in the wireless facilities in getting to 5G, in terms of either just pure financial costs and in terms of the other inputs, the employees that are properly trained, the components that go into it, and the regulatory barriers. Just where are the biggest challenges?
I'm not quite sure I got all the question, but yeah. Go ahead.
I was wondering about sort of is wireless really mostly a wireless problem, or is it mostly a wireline problem, or is it 50-50 in terms of A, costs, and B, other inputs like employees and technical components?
I will take the fifth on that, just because if you ask our members, they'll give you different perceptions of that, and I can't really give you a unified view from our perspective.
I mean, one thing I'll say, Lynn, and this is not really probably going to answer your question in a financial kind of way, but there's no question that consumers' insatiable demand for data doesn't just stop at the last hop between the device and the router in their home. Obviously, these things are on nodes, and at least in the cable architecture. The one thing I will say is you're starting to see, as the sophistication and the capabilities of networks continue to improve, and the demand for more and more video applications increases, it creates market opportunities for people who are going to want to go out and invest in business services or backhaul services. So you see, for example, in the cable business, you've got, I think, 16 million Wi-Fi hotspots out there, both in the home and out of the home, and probably close to 1 million that are outside of the home. Well, that's an opportunity not only for a customer who's in a park and wants to connect to Wi-Fi, but it's also its own network that is capable of providing backhaul services to other types of providers who may want to get that data and put it into a wire as quickly as they can. So, the insatiable demand for data, I think, creates market opportunities that hopefully will incent even more investment in the future.
And just as a follow-up to that, Tom, you mentioned 5G being the last mile competitor maybe, and maybe solving the rural broadband problem once and for all. And of course, the motivation for the question earlier to John about 5G is where are we in terms of the timing? And James, of course, you know, your companies are stakeholders in 5G
Sure.
as well. Where are we in the timeline? When might we expect a commercial application rollout of 5G? The 3GPP would obviously be integral here, but I mean, I've heard 2020. Any thoughts on that?
2020 seems to be the year everyone's talking about, both in terms of some of the Asian countries that are tying it to the Olympics and the 3GPP as well. You know, it all gets very definitional because on the one hand, I could say, well, until there is a 3GPP standard, sorry, it's not 5G, right? It's something that is new and different and is some company's version of or pre-version of 5G.
Calling it 5G.
But yeah, but you know, the testing is going on now, and I think you're going to see deployments, you know, as early as next year of what is at least some early version of 5G.
Yeah, and just on the unlicensed side, I think you're already seeing, you know, some of the really higher bandwidth, you know, even millimeter uses built into chips, you know, 802.11, I think it's AD, you know, there's an alphabet soup of different types of standards, but, you know, you'll have chips that have multi-modes that can work in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, you know, even higher down the band. Now, obviously, you know, you are limited by, you know, the range that some of the wireless waves can propagate at, but I think you're starting to see some of those even start to emerge, at least in the unlicensed space. And, you know, there's a symbiotic relationship. Cable now is at the beginning of a new technology cycle. They're rolling into, you know, DOCSIS 3.1, whereas today, you know, probably one of the standard offerings is 50, 100 megabit service. You know, now we're talking about making the leap to true multi-gigabit service. So, you know, you're not going to want to provide that type of service and then get stuck at your router for the speeds that you're trying to offer the consumer.
I think we have a question in the back.
Is this working? No? I can just be loud. Oh, there we go. Ooh, ooh. Will Reinhardt, American Action Forum. Very interested in this conversation. I've done a lot of data work actually on the digital divide, which seems to be very interesting. I was wondering if you guys could talk about age as a confounding variable here. And one of the things that I find consistently, both in the Pew data and then also in the NCTA data, which is the March supplement data, that when you actually take age as one of the variables, you actually see that in lower age brackets, there's almost no difference in income, in the variation between income quartiles in adoption of broadband. But as you get older, there actually is a bigger and bigger difference. So essentially, you know, if you're below 35 or so, that really the lowest income quartiles really don't matter that much in adoption of broadband compared to the highest income quartiles. But then again, as you go over time, as you start including people who are in their 40s, 50s, and then 60 plus, that difference between the income actually changes pretty dramatically, which oftentimes kind of skews the data that we look at just purely on income. So I was wondering if you could talk about age as this confounding variable, or how we're going to get individuals who are growing older onto the internet, because that, again, I think that's a pretty big concern for broadband adoption.
Pictures of their grandchildren. FaceTime with your grandchildren is a huge motivation for adoption. I'm being a little facetious.
Much better than you and most of Europe on this as far as the adoption is concerned, from what I understand.
I actually want to throw a question back to you if you've done the analysis, or maybe my panelists have. When you look at low-income young people, is it connectivity with a smartphone, or is it with a device that they can do their homework on?
That's From the data that I was looking at, the question was whether or not you have internet access at the home. So this is the Pew study from what I remember. I could go back and look at this. And I do know that I do understand, you're exactly right, there's a difference between adoption on the smartphone, which again, smartphone has, I mean, almost all broadband adoption at the home has decreased in the last year or so, and we've seen an increase for broadband adoption. So I understand, you're exactly right. This connectivity at the home is a really, really big question that still I think is not absolutely perfect. We don't know exactly what's happening there, but similarly, this age question I think is, I mean, I'm willing to talk to you offline more about this, but the age question I think is a really big one that we often don't talk about in these discussions.
I mean, I think it's a great point, and it's kind of intuitive in a sense that, you know, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she is a digital native, right? She ain't gonna know anything else. She's gonna have to teach her old man how to do some of this stuff. But there's no question that, you know, when you look at the numbers, you know, the cohort of people that have the greatest adoption gap are, you know, folks over 65, and that just means, you know, we probably ought to think about strategies, you know, particular types of applications that Debbie is talking about that create some relevancy for folks who otherwise might say, well, I can't be bothered. I do note that there are, you know, with Internet Essentials and the program I know that Charter is launching, they are focused on low-income senior populations as well. That's kind of not where these programs started from, but I think as the numbers have reflected, you know, a larger universe of folks who are falling into that adoption gap, who are in, you know, those senior years, you know, that's a place for us to focus. You know, on the flip side, I think it's good because, you know, it shows you that a lot of the folks who are, you know, growing up in today's internet age are, you know, whether consciously or unconsciously adopting, hopefully, some of the digital survival skills that will lead them to use technologies and hopefully, you know, improve their lives. You're never done with the adoption problem, right? There are always different permutations and fact sets and cohorts that I think you want to focus on. I mean, we're not done with the adoption problem for electricity or plumbing or a whole host of things, but you know, it's something that we need to continue to pay attention to because it really does serve as the platform, I think, for, you know, future economic growth.
I just wanted to add really briefly to that. I think, and I don't have data to prove this, but I would guess intrinsically that the adoption process or the barriers to adoption are cumulative, right? So if you have an income barrier, that's one, and then add on to that an education barrier or not being a digital native or all of these other things. And so the youth of today, they have a lot of the things in place. So if income's the only barrier, it's much easier to straddle that one than to straddle multiple. And I think that that's why the holistic nature of a lot of these adoption programs by the big telecom companies and others are really important, because just making internet free or really inexpensive is not enough. It's having the community centers where people can go and learn how to use the computer. And I think that that's gonna help, because income, as you can see by the age barrier, is probably not even the biggest barrier, let alone the only barrier. And I think that's highlighted by your example.
Well, we are running out of time, and so what I wanted to do to close out our session here is, one by one, starting with Debbie, policy wish to spur investment in broadband and people. If you had one policy wish for President Clinton or President Trump.
I want to follow on with what Tom said. We've been hearing about an infrastructure bank, and I think that there will be some interest in what kind of programs could fill the broadband deployment gap. And I want to learn from Tom's experience at NCTA on the BTOP program of what would be some ways to deal with those challenges that you mentioned of companies that know how to do this, that have employees ready and skilled and ready to do this. And that would be one. Can I do a second? Because we haven't talked about this. I am terrifically troubled by the offshoring of our customer service work. And I think we need to really figure out a way that we ensure that customers get quality service by people who are skilled and know how to answer and respond to their inquiry. So I think we also need to deal with that offshoring of that work.
I'm going to take two as well, and I'm also just going to repeat myself. So
Trump's going to reject both of them.
So one is Spectrum. I gave great credit to the FCC for what we've seen the last few years, but the pipeline now is what's next, and we've kind of we don't have anything specific after the high bands proceeding. And it can take 5 or 10 or more years from the time you identify a band that can be repurposed for broadband to it being deployed. And particularly with a transition coming up in administrations, that by itself can lead to a gap. So we really need to stay focused on that. And as I said, on the infrastructure front, that's something that is going to be vital for the success of 5G. And on the BTOP, just to respond, I will say, we did some postmortems after most of the BTOP projects were up and running and sort of looking at the ones that were really successful. And what was striking was the number of times you would hear people from different communities who had had successful BTOP projects say, well, we learned about this, and I'm the mayor, and I was talking to the college president, and the Chamber of Commerce director came over, and we sat together over coffee, and then it was just people coming together and going, we have to solve this together. It sounds hard to replicate. It's hard to create a process out of that, but that was where we saw a lot of success.
I might be repeating myself as well, but I think broadly we just need a systematic overhaul of the regulatory framework. I think it's overly burdensome and it's focused a lot of the burden on particular industries, and I think that we need to recognize the value of innovation and investment and how closely that's tied to productivity gains and standard of living, and start taking that into account when putting these regulations in place. And I think that R&D spending is huge in terms of the ties and productivity gains and such, and we've spoken at PPI before about an IP box in terms of tax reform, and I think just general tax reform to make it more pro-innovation, pro-investment friendly, so that these companies aren't functioning in such a difficult regulatory environment. We take the time to congratulate and identify these companies that are making such long-term investments, but then we're creating a really difficult environment for them to make such investments. And as we heard earlier, it takes 10 years for broadband returns to be seen. And so to have regulatory uncertainty when you're already having to make such a long-term gamble just makes the problem that much worse, and simplifying that and having some certainty for these companies, I think, would be hugely helpful.
James?
That sounded good. I may take it. I didn't have a second one. No. Look, I think this PPI report is a great primer for this type of discussion, because if there's anything I think it really highlights is it's how capital intensive this industry is, how ever-changing, how it constantly has the need for more capital to expand the capabilities and power and keep our networks really world-class. So if that is the end goal, I think there's no question that the policies need to be wrapped around things that will keep the cost of capital low, whether that is removing regulatory impediments or more macro policies through tax reforms that are going to focus on promoting important long-term types of investments. But then secondarily, we know that if our social goal is to reach everyone with broadband, we know that economics is not going to take us to 100%, and it requires that we are judicious and targeted in the federal policies that we're going to adopt in order to backfill, whether that is access or whether that it is to increase adoption rates. And if we keep our eye on that and let the private sector do what it does best, I think we have a bright future.
Well, thank you. That was a great note to close on. With that, Will, if you want to come up and close us out.
Sure. Well, thank you. Just working.
Now, yeah. Well, thank you very much. First, thank this marvelous panel for a thoughtful discussion. Appreciate that. And Paul for really orchestrating both of these conversations. So definitely thank you for that duty. So let's hear it for Paul. And finally, I just want to thank the people that really put on the show here and made it all work. The great Sloan Hurst and Jana Platt. Where's Jana? Daniel Mack, and the great Carolyn Brandon, who helped inspire this event. So thank you all, and enjoy the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Don't forget to unhook.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
So we can try to get that recorded.